today's presentation, we are going to be talking about wetlands and specifically more about their importance and the roles that they play, and especially focusing on some of the cool biological diversity of some of the species that call estuaries and wetlands home. And we will be focusing a little bit more on the Chesapeake Bay, since that is where we are located currently. But I will tell you a little bit about myself before we get started. So my name is Tara Rudo. I am the Marine Education Specialist at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia. So we are located on the VIMS campus in Gloucester Point, Virginia. And yes, I've received my master's from UNC Wilmington in Environmental Studies. I ventured down to Georgia after graduation and completed a short AmeriCorps service term down there. So this image here shows me doing virtual learning with a sea turtle before virtual learning was the hot topic. And after that, I got some exposure into doing husbandry and working with marine animals. And I accepted a aquarist job in the Greensboro Science Center in North Carolina. And there I was in charge of and assisted in the taking care of freshwater fish, some of our sharks and rays. Pictured in the middle there is Surfer, he's a spotted eagle ray, and our giant Pacific octopus. So I really loved animal care, and I got to learn a lot about many different aquatic animals, but I was always drawn back to education, and that brought me to where I am today. And I started this position back in January of this year. So unfortunately, my job is usually doing public programs and field trips and summer camps, but due to coronavirus, that was all put on the back burner. So most of my job now has been really adapting a lot of our programs to a virtual setting. And it's definitely been a learning experience for me, making videos and doing virtual presentations, but in a way I've learned a lot from it. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you about one of my favorite topics. A little bit more about where I currently work. So the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia is one of 29 sites which are part of the National Estuarine Research Reserve system. And there are, like I mentioned, 29 sites located throughout the United States. And all of these sites really focus on the conservation and preservation of these estuarine environments, and really telling people why they're important, exposing the public to them, and getting people involved and educated on why we should protect these areas. So even though the ecology on the West Coast might look a lot different than the East Coast, all of these sites have that common mission of really preserving and conserving our estuarine environments. Now, the Chesapeake Bay Reserve in Virginia, there is one in Maryland as well, but the Virginia one, we have 4 specific departments. So we have our research team. So they're the ones out there getting muddy and getting in the dirt, and you'll see them on the boat sometime on the York River. We have our stewardship team as well that work very closely with our research team. We have our coastal training program, and they really focus on bringing the public and working with local government organizations. And then I'm part of our education team. And so, like I mentioned, we focus on field trips and summer camp programming. And during a global pandemic, we still are striving our best to provide those programs. And we do a lot of partnerships, of course, with VIMS and some of the graduate students at VIMS. But we'll go ahead and dive in on today's topic. But before we do that, it's important that we define what exactly a wetland is. And this was pulled from the NOAA website, since the reserve system is funded through the NOAA organization. And a wetland is an area of land that is saturated with water. So it's really focused on that land rather than the water. And NOAA does a good job in defining this, because they mention how all these wetlands can come in different shapes and sizes, and they're located all around the world, and each one is a little bit different from one another. But we are also going to be talking specifically about what an estuary is. And estuaries are bodies of water that are usually found where rivers meet the sea. And I have a short video down here. This was taken at Goodwin Islands, located just south of our office here in Vims. And this is right on the shoreline. It shows a good example of what that estuary looks like. And in these estuaries, we find what we call brackish water. So since it's where the rivers meet the sea, rivers tend to have fresh water, and our oceans are seawater. So you have a very diverse mix here, and that's what we call brackish. So it's right in between fresh and salt water. And of course, that can vary in location. Now, I did mention that we're going to talk a little bit about the Chesapeake Bay since that's where we're located. And this image on your screen here actually shows the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And a watershed is an area of land where all of those tributaries, whether it be small creeks or streams, all drain down to a common body of water, and that being the Chesapeake Bay. And that little star there locates where we're located here in Gloucester Point. And so the Chesapeake Bay watershed is very massive, 64,000 square miles of land, and it includes 6 different states. So a lot of the times when people think of watersheds, they think, oh, it's just one within a state, but the Chesapeake Bay is a little bit different when it comes to that. And it also does include, of course, Washington, D.C. There isn't just a lot of land, but there is a lot of shoreline as well within this watershed. Close to 12,000 miles of tidal shoreline, and that even includes a lot of those tidal creeks and those small islands within the Chesapeake Bay itself. And approximately 17 million people live within this watershed, and that means it's still growing, of course, population growth, but it also means you may live in northern Pennsylvania, pretty far away from the Chesapeake Bay itself, but your actions do impact the Chesapeake Bay because you are located within that watershed. So all those people within this watershed do impact the Chesapeake Bay quite a bit. Some other important reasons why the Chesapeake Bay is should be protected and conserved over time. So this body of water holds on average around 15 trillion gallons of water. So it's not just a large amount of land, it's a large body of water. But it's not very deep in a lot of places, that average depth being around 21 feet. I believe the deepest point in the Chesapeake Bay is around 175 feet. But on average, it's a pretty shallow body of water. And there's 150 major rivers and streams that drain directly into this bay within that Chesapeake Bay watershed. My favorite fact about this area is it supports more than 3,600 species. And that's not just talking about animals, so that includes plants as well. So there's a lot of diversity within the Chesapeake Bay. And we produce 500 million pounds of seafood per year. So I know many of you probably really enjoy eating oysters and blue crabs, and those are really, really important fisheries, and we want to make sure we have strict regulations put in place to make sure those areas aren't over harvested, but that we can still generate revenue based on seafood, and that we can still enjoy a delicious blue crab feast or oyster feast. And then also the Bay does provide a lot of jobs for people, whether that be jobs like mine with education. It could be watermen that go out and harvest blue crabs and oysters. It also produces a lot of money and helps to stimulate our economy. And of course, it's a beautiful area, so we love to really enjoy it recreationally. So that can be kayaking, boating, fishing, lots of ways for people to enjoy the Chesapeake Bay. It's also a very productive ecosystem. And these are all images that were taken by some of our staff within the last few months. And productive ecosystem meaning a lot of diversity within this area. So our lovely eastern oysters, we have a lot of oysteries within the Chesapeake Bay. And that other iconic species being our blue crabs. So those are two that are harvested pretty often, especially during the warmer months of the year. Here at the Chesapeake Bay Reserve in Virginia, we focus a lot too on the studying of seagrasses because we have a lot of seagrass beds. And that seagrass plays a vital role. It helps to protect animals, provides them shelter. It can provide them with food. And so it's really important that we have good water quality so our seagrasses can thrive. Some other animals that we might see, especially during the warmer months, we have our northern pufferfish, which we'll talk about a little bit later. My personal favorite are diamondback terrapins, which are a type of turtle that are found within marsh environments. This might look like a flounder down here. This is actually a hog choker. So they lay flat on the bottom and have both their eyes on the top so they can look out for any kind of predator or look for prey. And we have a lot of different species of jellyfish that come through our ecosystem. So sometimes we might see comb jellies, but this was actually taken down at Goodwin. It's a sea nettle, and we can have pretty large swarms of them come through, especially during the summertime. Now, wetlands, as we talked about, very diverse areas, and we give a little wetlands 101. So wetlands are a area that are flooded daily, so meaning they have 2 high tides and 2 low tides. And so the picture on the left shows you a wetland where that tide has gone out, and so it exposes a lot of that mud, okay? And a lot of animals might come out during that time. Now, when it's high tide, that tide comes back in and it covers up that area, sometimes even further in. And this is another video taken. This was taken down also at Goodwin. So this is kind of in between the tides. And as you can see, it's covering up a lot more than this one was. So that tide is currently coming in closer to the shoreline. These areas are also very nutrient rich. So all that marsh mud that you see there, that is called detritus. And detritus is broken down organic material, so things like plants and animals. And even though that mud might smell really bad, that's one thing people say when they go in the marsh, it smells like sulfur. And it's actually all of that mud that they're smelling. And that mud is really, really good for our wetlands. It's filled with a lot of nutrients. And so we want to, that's actually a good thing. So even though it smells bad, it's a very, very good thing for our wetlands to have that. And as I mentioned, there's a wide variety of residents and species that call these wetlands home, from birds to macroinvertebrates to fish. Tons of different animals and plants call the Chesapeake Bay wetland their home. And some of the common ones you might find. So this plant up here is called Spartina alterniflora. It is a salt-tolerant cordgrass, and it's very abundant in a lot of estuaries. And it usually tends to be very green during the warmer months of the year, and it'll start to turn brown during the colder time. But a lot of species will utilize this cordgrass, like our common periwinkle snail down there. You'll see them actually climbing up the grass to escape the tide that's coming in, and then they'll crawl back down when the tide goes out and it's safe for them to come back down. But they'll actually eat things along that cordgrass, or they'll eat the cordgrass itself. We also find fiddler crabs. That's something, especially when we take kids out in the marsh, they love to spot those fiddler crabs. The males have that large claw there, and what they'll do is they'll actually wave it up and down in the air like so. That's how they call over to their lady friends. And it's kind of like they're playing a fiddle when they're doing that, so hence the name fiddler crab. And then our eastern oysters, they are a bivalve. And so they're not just something that we eat, but they're very important for our estuaries because they take in all the water. They can filter up to 50 gallons a day, and they basically are able to extract nice, clean water. And we find that areas that have these oysters have really good water quality versus places that don't have them. So that's why there is a lot of effort into going into oyster restoration and building oyster reefs to really ensure the longevity of that species. And there are other species as well. Our great blue heron, you'll see them with their like stilt-like legs. So they can really walk through that grass to find their prey. Ospreys are probably one of my favorite bird species, a predatory bird. and you'll see them flying down, and they use their large talons to pick out fish. So we see them, we actually have a osprey live cam here at VIMS. We have a nest that some of our staff keep an eye on so we can see their chicks when they hatch. It's pretty cool. We also see horseshoe crabs. So they spawn during the warmer months of the year, and they actually aren't related to crabs. They're actually closely related to spiders, and people tend to be a little scared of them because of their appearance, but they're harmless to people. But again, we'll usually only see them during the summer, late spring. And then my personal favorite are diamondback terrapin. Again, that marsh turtle. So the females will come out of the marsh during the summertime to lay their nests. And here at the Chesapeake Bay Reserve in Virginia, we actually have research members that go out to Goodwin and are looking at ways to better the nests and so that they don't get predated, because there is a large raccoon population out there. So there's some research being done right here at VIMS for our terrapins. But of course, we can't forget our fish, lots and lots of fish. So our northern puffer fish, they do puff up quite a bit when they feel stressed or they feel like they need to defend themselves. Our sea robin, they have these wing-like fins here. So that's why, hence the name robin. They kind of almost look like a bird. They can swim fairly fast through the water. We have lined seahorses. Those are pretty common too. They love to hide in all of that seagrass. They camouflage really well within it. And again, those males actually are the ones that deliver the offspring. If you've ever seen videos of that, I highly suggest checking it out. Very cool. American half-beaks down here is a type of schooling fish that we see pretty often. They have, if you look very closely at this image, the top portion of their beak is relatively short compared to that bottom. So that's the easy way we can tell them apart towards some other fish species that we find. And then skillet fish. They're a species of fish that have a pretty large suction cup on the bottom. So this image, they're in like a plexiglass container, and he's suctioned right to that box pretty well. And sometimes when we pull out some equipment onto the boat, they will fall onto the boat deck, and it's a little tricky to get them off. That suction cup is pretty strong. So that's a lot of our species diversity that we see from birds and invertebrates to fish. So the Chesapeake Bay has a very large amount of species, and that's just touching the surface there. Now, there are problems that our wetlands do face. The most common ones being these days sea level rise. So with climate change being a really popular topic, we're seeing that there's an elevation in sea level rise, and so that is affecting our estuaries quite a bit, and it does affect tidal changes too. We also have a series of invasive species, and that's pictured over here on the right-hand side. These are Phragmites, and an invasive species is a species that's not native, and when you have a species that's not native, they don't have any natural predators to take them out. So they basically take over, and this can really affect a lot of native species. It can affect their growth, it can affect the food chain. So there is a lot of regulation in place to make sure invasive species are either eliminated or kept under a very close eye, because we don't want them going out of control or anything like that. And then coastal development. So I would love to have a home on the water. I can't imagine anyone wouldn't. So there is a lot of development right on coastlines, and especially in wetland areas. But there is a lot of permitting that goes behind it. You can only build a house or build a hotel a certain amount, a certain distance away from that coastline. So there is a lot of regulation and a lot of permitting that goes into this coastal development. But you know, when you have a lot of construction and you're disturbing that natural land, it's going to change a little bit even under that regulation. So again, something we definitely want to keep in check and monitor over time. And so pictured here are what look like 5 random items, and they are, but these 5 random items actually have something in common. And that is that these all represent our wetlands, and specifically a function that our wetlands play. And so the first one that we're going to be talking about is that sponge. And so this is something that we do with a lot of kids. It's like a metaphor game. And the sponges are going to be used in the demonstration I'll be showing you guys in a little bit. But sponges are a good example of a wetland function because they absorb a lot of excess water. So when we have large flooding events, large storms, these wetlands do a great job of preventing that flooding from going further inland. And they also can absorb a lot of excess nutrients that enter that area. So that can be from further inland going out towards the Atlantic. So they do a good job of basically acting like a buffer and acting like a sponge in that sense. The next item being a strainer. So something we find in our kitchen, but our wetlands do this by filtering or straining out debris. And again, this can come from storms like hurricanes. It can prevent a lot of those large debris items from moving further inland. And it also can filter out a lot of excess sediment. So when you have a lot of construction or housing developments going up, you're introducing a lot of sediment to that area. And so again, these wetlands are able to kind of strain that so it's not being overwhelmed in a sense. And our bed, one of my favorite places to be, but a bed acts like a wetland in the sense that it provides a resting place for a lot of migratory birds. So on their very long journey, whether they're going north or south, they will use wetlands as basically like a pit stop. And so this also can be said for a lot of those species we talked about earlier, and the diversity is this provides a home for a lot of them. So this might be their permanent home, or it could be just an area that they spend time in for one phase of their life. So wetlands do act like a home and a resting stop for a lot of various species. A bar of soap. So wetlands are able to clean polluted water in a sense. So we mentioned how oysters, they actually are filter feeders, so they're able to clean water. But the problem is that, you know, too much pollution being introduced into this environment can overwhelm a wetland. It's all about things in moderation. And this is going to really be demonstrated in a little bit about that. But the wetlands do a good job of basically cleaning themselves and preventing a lot of pollution from entering the Atlantic Ocean. I believe there's one more. Yep. Is our baby bottle. So this is supposed to represent how our wetlands provide shelter and protection for a lot of species, or they act like a nursery. So I mentioned those seagrasses, they provide protection for a lot of species like that line seahorse. But there are certain species that only spend a certain amount of their time in a marsh or in a wetland, and then they move on to the Atlantic Ocean. They're born in that wetland and then they move on. And this is really critical that if we don't protect our wetlands, we don't have those species because that's where they begin their life. And if they can't begin their life there, they're gonna have to somewhere else. So the baby bottle is definitely a good representation of our wetlands acting like a nursery. And so for our wetlands demonstration, I have a short video to show you all. So this was a video that was filmed for our Summer on the Bay program. Since our summer camp program was canceled due to the global pandemic, we created 12 weeks of content, each week being a different theme. And we created videos, resources for the public to utilize. And this was a demonstration we did for our Teaching Marsh week. And I chose it just because it was probably the best take that we did and does a good job of demonstrating how our wetlands function like that sponge and absorb a lot of pollutants over time. So I believe it's around a 5-minute clip. Hi everyone. This week's theme for Summer on the Bay is our Teaching Marsh. And the best way that we're going to teach you about the marsh today is by doing a short demonstration on the importance of wetlands. And what we have here is we have 2 paint trays. So one does not have sponges, one does have sponges. So the paint tray itself represents land. So the black one represents land without a wetland. Our red tray represents land with a wetland, the wetland being those sponges. And that's because a wetland it acts like a sponge because it can absorb a lot of things that we're going to be talking about today. So on our land, we are going to put a couple different forms of pollutants because further upstream, we have tons of pollutants that can end up in our waterways. One of those pollutants are sediment. So we have some coffee grounds here to represent that today. But you know, when there's a lot of runoff, a lot of excess sediment can wash down to our waterways. So we are going to sprinkle some sediment on the land without wetlands, and we'll sprinkle some on the land with wetlands. The next thing that we are going to add, another pollutant that's pretty common, we're going to add some fertilizer. So fertilizers are used in a lot of farms, and again, when it rains, a lot of those sediments and that fertilizer can wash down to our waterways, to our wetlands. So we have some sprinkles here to represent that fertilizer, and we'll sprinkle the sprinkles on our land without wetlands and on the land with wetlands. The next pollutant that we're going to talk about is litter. So this can be plastic bottles, it can be aluminum cans, paper. So again, when it rains, all of those pollutants wash into storm drains and eventually down to our wetlands and our waterways. So we have some shredded up paper to represent some litter. So we'll go ahead and sprinkle that on the land without a wetland and the land with a wetland. Perfect. And the final pollutant that we're going to talk about, not maple syrup, but it's going to represent oil, specifically oils that run off from our cars. Because again, when it rains, that oil slick can wash into storm drains down to our wetlands. So maple syrup is a great example of that oil. And we'll sprinkle a little here and here. So now that we have deposited all our pollutants on that land without a wetland and with a wetland, we are now going to simulate a storm. So here in Virginia, we don't really encounter hurricanes that often, but especially during the summertime, we have pretty large afternoon thunderstorms. So my watering can here is representing that rainstorm today. So we're gonna go ahead, have the rain come down on the land without a wetland. Pretty large storm, I would say. We'll let that run down. And I'm going to come on over to this side, and we're going to do the same thing. Pretty large afternoon thunderstorm. Perfect. So now that is going to rinse down. So again, this is simulating when we have a storm further upland. All of that storm water we call will wash into storm drains that's not filtered, eventually into creeks and rivers, and down to our marshes and eventually our oceans. So now that our storm has passed, we are going to look at what happened. So I'm going to remove our land without a wetland. Yep, and as you guys can see here, all of this is what has washed into our oceans and into our marshes. So you see a lot of that sediment, you see some fertilizer, you see a lot of litter here, and there is some oil slick on here from that motor oil. So unfortunately, a lot of pollutants ended up in our waterways because there wasn't a wetland there. And to show how important wetlands are, if we switch on over to this side, we'll remove this guy. You'll notice in our pan here, it's fairly clean. You know, some things got through. I see a little bit of sediment, a little fertilizer, and a little bit of that, that litter that washed down, but relatively pretty clear. So that wetland did a really great job of acting like a sponge, and it absorbed a lot of those pollutants and prevented it from entering our waterways. And that's exactly why we want to ensure that our wetlands stay nice and healthy. We want to educate people about why they're so important. Some people might think they're pretty smelly, don't really understand the importance of them. So I hope this was a great example of why we really do value our wetlands and why our marshes are beautiful. Thank you, guys. So that demonstration is used in a lot of classrooms that I've seen. A lot of people will use Enviroscapes and that metaphor game. So there are ways that you can kind of adapt those programs. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, a lot of it has to be video sharing. But if we return back to normal, those are definitely, if you guys are teachers at all, those are easy interactive ways to educate your students and teach them about wetlands in the classroom, even if you're not able to visit one in person. But I do want to end on ways that we can help protect these areas. So these are some images over my time, whether in grad school or down in Georgia or actually just here in Virginia. So I mentioned in that video something about stormwater. And if you're not familiar with stormwater, it's all that rainwater that comes down and you'll see those storm drains on the side of the road. And when that rainwater goes into those storm drains, that water is not filtered. It's not like wastewater. It's never filtered. It goes directly into local waterways and eventually down to the bay and then down to the ocean. So we always want to make sure that that stormwater isn't picking up litter. It's not picking up any harmful pollutants because it will make its way down. So I've seen a lot of artwork that's actually taken, this top right photo was taken in Richmond. If you drop it, I drink it, just educating people about what goes in this drain ends up in our waterways. So just being aware of those kind of issues. On the left-hand side, while I was in grad school, we did a lot of work with local organizations doing oyster reef restoration. We were planting some Spartina in areas that were had balding effects of Spartina. So working with local organizations is always a great project to do. And then something as simple as doing something like a beach sweep. So it can be on the actual beach or it can be just in your local neighborhood. We're working with some students on that currently. So just preventing that litter from ending up in a place that it shouldn't be. There are ways that you guys can definitely help these wetlands, even if you live hundreds of miles away from them. But I do want to thank you guys, especially the Williamsburg Regional Library, for having us today and getting the opportunity to speak with you all and show you some of the work that we've been doing. If you're interested in any VIMS updates, so the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, our website, vims.edu, we have a newsletter that goes out. And if you would like to sign up for that newsletter, it gives you updates on any kind of events. Most of them are virtual right now, but a really great resource. They send it out pretty often, so you can sign up for that there. But again, I just wanted to thank you guys. If you had any other questions after this presentation, you can feel free to reach out to me. I have my contact information down there, and you can check out some of our, the Chesapeake Bay Reserve System in Virginia's. We have a Facebook, an Instagram, and a YouTube page. So if you guys are interested in any of that, you have those links available as well. But I would definitely love to answer any questions that anyone has.
Yep, we do have a couple questions. First question is, I was wondering if there's any specific species that's especially harmed by the rising sea levels you spoke about earlier.
Yeah, so a lot of those species that would be affected by that are going to be the ones I actually talked about in the slide where we talked about like common periwinkle snails, ones that are relatively small that just can't fly away. So those are species that would have to move to new locations further inland. And with it increasing over time, sea level rise can be relatively slow in some areas, but it can also be pretty high in other areas. So, you know, you're having a lot of species have to basically reestablish themselves in different locations. And it can also change the overall like geography of an area over time. So you might have species that like migratory birds that usually stop in one place, they might not be able to stop there in the future because it's submerged with water where there used to be land there. But it does affect a lot of also fish as well. So when you have rising sea level, the water quality over time does change. So you have different types of salinity. You have different turbidity and pH changes. And so certain fish and macroinvertebrates are really sensitive to that. So if that environment changes, they basically either unfortunately might not make it or they have to relocate somewhere else. So it can basically just displace a lot of animals.
Our next question is, do you know how many species live exclusively in a marsh?
So that's kind of a tricky question. I don't know a specific number on the top of my head. There are certain species that do live exclusively in the marsh, but a lot of them do just spend a period of time in the marsh. So unfortunately, I don't have an exact number that specifically live within the marsh itself during their whole lifetime. But one, like when we were talking about diamondback terrapins, so terrapins are a marsh turtle. So I think they're really the only marsh turtle that you'll see there. And so you won't find them really in the middle of the ocean like you would find sea turtles, and you won't find them in like freshwater rivers and lakes like you find snapping turtles or sliders or anything like that. But I can definitely look into that and answer that a little bit later, just because I don't know the exact number of species that live exclusively in the marsh, but it's a good question.
So our next question is, does trapping pollutants harm wetland health?
That's a great question. So in a certain capacity, it can. So it's like I mentioned earlier about everything is good in moderation. So if you have an overwhelming amount of pollutants that are being trapped within a wetland, yes, it can harm the wetland because it's not able to process it quickly enough. It's not able to naturally recover from it fast enough. So if you do have a higher than average number of pollutants that are being brought downstream into these wetlands and they're being trapped there, that can be the problem and it can cause harm. But again, if it's all about thinking about our actions further inland. So preventing those pollutants from even ending up down in that wetland is definitely our priority. We always want to target the source of the pollutants rather than just cleaning it up or leaving the wetlands to handle it. Because they can handle it, it's just when they can be overwhelmed, definitely. So again, it's all about our actions further upland and what we can do to prevent those pollutants from even ending up in the marsh in the first place. Good question.
What's the most unusual thing you've ever personally found or caught? And it can be either an animal or it can be a very weird pollutant.
Oh, that's a good question. I found a lot of things. Actually, this is pretty interesting. Over the last few months when I've been out, usually we see a lot of, like when I do cleanups, like picking up trash, I see a lot of like cigarette butts and plastics, but I've been seeing a lot of masks lately, the medical masks. And, you know, of course it's because we have an increased use in them. But I think it's interesting how that's becoming one of the most popular things I'm seeing on the street that are getting washed down in these storm drains or even found on beaches and in marshes. That's not a pollutant that people really saw before this global pandemic. So I think it's just been an interesting thing to find that I never really thought about. So just being aware of even something that protects us might not be protecting our environment as well. So I think that's been pretty interesting. But I want to thank you guys for joining us. I really enjoyed getting to do a live virtual experience with you guys.
And thank you everybody for spending your afternoon with us. And we want to thank our near neighbors at VIMS. It's really great that you guys have this program where we're able to give these joint presentations and get a bigger audience for both of us. So thank you everybody for spending your afternoon with us. Hopefully you get out and enjoy the weather. Just keep in mind what you're throwing away. Make sure those masks get in the proper containers when you're done with them, if they're not reusable. And thank you very much.
Thank you guys.